November 1943, somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto gripped the controls of his damaged aircraft as smoke filled the cockpit, the altitude gauge spinning wildly as he descended toward the endless blue below. He had heard the stories whispered among his unit, tales of American brutality toward captured Japanese soldiers, accounts of torture and execution that matched everything his superiors had told him about the enemy. As the ocean rushed up to meet him, Yamamoto made a silent vow: if captured, he would reveal nothing and accept whatever fate awaited him with honor. What Yamamoto could not have known as his plane hit the water was that within weeks he would be sitting in a heated barracks in rural Wisconsin, receiving treatment from American doctors who worked as hard to save Japanese lives as they did for their own wounded, eating 3 meals a day that exceeded what many American civilians received under rationing, and struggling to reconcile everything he had been taught about his captors with the bewildering reality unfolding before his eyes. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how thousands of Japanese prisoners of war, conditioned to expect death and dishonor, instead encountered something their training had never prepared them for: systematic humanity in the face of war, and how that unexpected mercy would transform not just individual lives, but contribute to the complex rebuilding of relations between two nations that had sought each other's destruction. The war in the Pacific had been particularly brutal from its beginning in December 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor had shocked America into conflict, and the subsequent island campaigns across the Pacific had become legendary for their ferocity. But by late 1943, the tide had turned decisively in favor of the Allied forces. American industrial might was producing ships, aircraft, and weapons at a pace that astounded even optimistic projections, while Japanese resources dwindled under the strain of maintaining far-flung defensive positions across thousands of miles of ocean. For Japanese military personnel, capture represented something far worse than death. The Senjin-kun Military Code, issued in January 1941, explicitly stated that surrender was unacceptable under any circumstances. Soldiers were expected to fight to the last man, or take their own lives rather than face the shame of captivity. This cultural conditioning, combined with propaganda depicting Americans as barbaric and cruel, meant that Japanese soldiers often chose self-destruction over the possibility of becoming prisoners. Yet as American forces pushed westward across the Pacific, the number of Japanese prisoners began to increase, slowly at first, then in growing numbers as wounded soldiers found themselves unable to carry out final acts of resistance, or as situations developed where surrender became unavoidable. These men arrived in American custody expecting torture, execution, or at best slow death from starvation and disease. What they encountered instead would challenge every assumption they held. The American military faced an unprecedented challenge in dealing with these prisoners. The Geneva Conventions provided guidelines for treatment of POWs, but the cultural gulf between American and Japanese military traditions was vast. Additionally, anti-Japanese sentiment ran high in the United States following Pearl Harbor and reports of Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners in places like the Philippines and Burma. Many Americans questioned why resources should be devoted to caring for enemy soldiers when their own boys were fighting and dying in the Pacific. Yet the United States government, for reasons both practical and principled, committed to treating Japanese prisoners according to international law and basic humanitarian standards. This decision was partly pragmatic, setting an example that might encourage better treatment of American POWs held by Japan, but it also reflected American values regarding human rights and the rule of law even in wartime. Camp McCoy in Wisconsin became one of several dozen prisoner-of-war camps established across the American interior, far from coastal areas where security concerns were highest. The camp, located in the rolling countryside near the town of Sparta, was designed to house several thousand prisoners in barracks that, while basic, provided protection from Wisconsin's harsh winters, adequate sanitation, and access to medical facilities. When the first groups of Japanese prisoners arrived at Camp McCoy in spring of 1944, the scene was unlike anything the American guards had anticipated. Many prisoners were visibly terrified, some trembling or refusing to make eye contact. Medical personnel conducting intake examinations found men with untreated wounds, severe malnutrition, and tropical diseases. But most striking was the psychological state of these prisoners, men who genuinely believed they were about to be subjected to terrible treatment or execution. Sergeant Robert Henderson of the Camp Medical Corps later wrote to his wife describing his first encounter with the arriving prisoners. "They looked at us like we were monsters," he wrote. "One young fellow, couldn't have been more than 19, kept bowing and saying what we later learned was 'kill me quickly' in Japanese. When our doc started cleaning and bandaging his infected leg wound instead, the kid just broke down crying. I've never seen anything like it." The camp administration, led by Colonel James Mitchell, a career army officer who had served in France during the First World War, established protocols that prioritized both security and humane treatment. Mitchell understood that well-treated prisoners were easier to manage, less likely to attempt desperate escapes, and potentially valuable sources of intelligence, but his approach went beyond mere practicality. Mitchell believed that how America treated its enemies said something fundamental about American values, and he was determined that his command would uphold those values regardless of the difficulties involved. The medical care provided to Japanese prisoners at Camp McCoy and similar facilities represented one of the most striking contrasts with their expectations. The camp hospital was staffed by American military doctors and nurses who treated Japanese patients with the same standard of care provided to American personnel. Prisoners suffering from malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and combat injuries received sulfur drugs, proper nutrition, and, in some cases, complex surgical procedures that would have been unavailable even to Japanese officers in forward combat areas. Lieutenant Yamamoto, the pilot who had crashed into the Pacific months earlier, found himself recovering from his injuries in the camp hospital ward. He later described his confusion and suspicion during those first weeks. "I could not understand why they worked so hard to keep us alive," he recalled in a diary entry. "Every day the doctors came, checking our temperatures, changing bandages, giving us medicine. The nurses smiled at us, actually smiled. I kept waiting for the moment when this pretense would end and the real treatment would begin. But that moment never came." The food provided to prisoners was another source of bewilderment. While not identical to traditional Japanese cuisine, the camp kitchen made efforts to provide rice and vegetables in addition to standard American military rations. Prisoners received 3 meals daily with caloric content that met or exceeded Geneva Convention requirements. For men who had been surviving on reduced rations in the field and who expected starvation as captives, this level of nutrition seemed incomprehensible. Corporal Hiroshi Tanaka, a former infantryman captured on Saipan, wrote about his first meal at Camp McCoy. "They gave us rice, real rice, and vegetables, and even some fish. The portions were larger than what I had received as a soldier in the field. I thought perhaps they were fattening us for some terrible purpose. But as the weeks passed and the food kept coming, I began to wonder if perhaps everything we had been told about the Americans was wrong." The camp also provided recreational facilities that seemed absurd to prisoners, conditioned to expect harsh treatment. There was a library with books in Japanese, areas for sports including baseball, equipment for traditional Japanese games like go and shogi, and even materials for artistic pursuits. Prisoners could write letters home, though these were censored for security purposes, and they received packages from the International Red Cross containing additional supplies and comfort items. Perhaps most surprising to the Japanese prisoners was the respect shown for their cultural practices and dignity. The camp administration allowed prisoners to conduct religious ceremonies, maintain traditional customs where possible, and organize their internal affairs according to Japanese military hierarchy, as long as this did not compromise security. This recognition of their humanity and culture stood in stark contrast to the propaganda that had depicted Americans as culturally destructive barbarians. The psychological impact of this treatment created a profound crisis for many prisoners. The entire framework through which they understood the war and their role in it was built on the assumption that the enemy was fundamentally evil, that capture meant disgrace and suffering. When reality contradicted these beliefs so completely, prisoners faced a difficult process of mental adjustment. Some prisoners initially interpreted the good treatment as a trap or a form of psychological warfare designed to extract information. They maintained rigid discipline, refused to communicate beyond the minimum required, and waited for the situation to reveal its true nature. But as weeks became months, and the humane treatment continued without demands for intelligence or confessions of war crimes, this suspicion became harder to maintain. Other prisoners experienced what camp psychologists later termed cognitive dissonance shock, a state of confusion and disorientation when deeply held beliefs collided with contradictory evidence. These men struggled to reconcile their indoctrination with their experiences, sometimes becoming depressed or withdrawn as they processed the implications of their situation. The guards at Camp McCoy faced their own challenges in this unusual situation. Many had relatives fighting in the Pacific or had themselves expected to be sent into combat against Japanese forces. Managing prisoners from a nation that had attacked their country without warning required them to set aside personal feelings and maintain professional conduct. For some, this proved easier than anticipated as they interacted with prisoners and began to see them as individual human beings rather than faceless enemies. Private First Class Thomas Walsh, a guard at Camp McCoy, wrote in his journal about his changing perceptions. When they first arrived, I'll admit, I saw them as Japs, the enemy, the people killing our guys in the Pacific. But after months of daily contact, checking on their barracks, supervising work details, you start to see them differently. There's Yamamoto, who's always reading and writing in his diary, Tanaka, who taught some of us to play Go, young Sato, who cries at night for his mother. They're soldiers like us, caught up in something bigger than themselves. The work program at Camp McCoy provided another avenue for interaction between prisoners and Americans. Under Geneva Convention rules, enlisted prisoners could be required to perform non-military labor, and many Japanese prisoners were assigned to work on nearby farms, in food processing facilities, or on camp maintenance. This work served multiple purposes. It provided needed labor in a region facing shortages due to military mobilization, gave prisoners productive activity to fill their days, and created opportunities for contact with civilian Americans. Local Wisconsin farmers who employed prisoner work details often reported surprise at the prisoners' work ethic and behavior. Robert Jensen, who ran a dairy farm near Sparta, recalled his experience with a prisoner work crew. I was nervous at first, having enemy soldiers on my property, but they worked harder than any help I'd ever had. They were polite, careful with the equipment, and seemed grateful for the opportunity to be outside the camp. My wife started packing extra sandwiches for them, and you'd have thought we gave them gold bars, the way they thanked her. These civilian encounters provided prisoners with a broader view of American society beyond the military context. They observed family farms, small towns, churches, schools, and the rhythms of ordinary American life continuing despite the war. For prisoners who had been taught that Americans were decadent, weak, and culturally inferior, these observations raised uncomfortable questions about their prior understanding. The camp also housed a small number of Japanese-American interpreters and cultural advisors, men whose presence was particularly significant for the prisoners. These Americans of Japanese descent, many of whom had volunteered for military service despite facing discrimination and internment of their own families, provided crucial bridges between the prisoners and American staff. Their existence itself was a revelation to some prisoners, demonstrating that people of Japanese heritage could be loyal Americans, a concept that challenged the racial ideology underlying Japanese wartime propaganda. Lieutenant Kenji Nakamura, a Japanese-American serving as an interpreter at Camp McCoy, described the complex dynamics of his position. The prisoners looked at me with confusion and sometimes contempt at first. I was Japanese, yet I wore an American uniform and had chosen to serve the country fighting against Japan. But over time, many prisoners would seek me out to ask questions, not about intelligence matters, but about America, about democracy, about how someone who looked like them could be American. Those conversations planted seeds that I think grew into something significant. As 1944 progressed into 1945, News from the Pacific Theater brought increasingly clear signs that Japan was losing the war. American forces captured island after island, moving inexorably closer to the Japanese home islands. The devastating firebombing campaigns against Japanese cities, though not discussed in detail with prisoners, became known through various channels. For prisoners at Camp McCoy, living in relative comfort and safety, there was a growing awareness that their families back home were likely suffering far more than they were. This realization created complex emotional responses. Some prisoners felt guilt about their safety, while their countrymen suffered. Others began to quietly question whether the military leadership that had brought Japan into this war had served the nation's best interests. These doubts were rarely spoken aloud, especially among prisoners who maintained strict loyalty to military hierarchy, but they were reflected in diaries and letters that revealed growing uncertainty about the war's purpose and outcome. The camp education program, established in late 1944, represented one of the most forward-thinking aspects of the prisoner experience. American authorities recognized that eventually these prisoners would return to Japan and could play a role in the post-war period. Educational courses were offered in English, American civics, democratic principles, agricultural techniques, and various trades. Participation was voluntary, and initially many prisoners refused, viewing such classes as indoctrination attempts, but gradually prisoners began to attend, motivated by curiosity, boredom, or a pragmatic recognition that skills and knowledge might be valuable in an uncertain future. These classes became forums for discussion and debate about different systems of government, individual rights, and social organization. For prisoners who had lived their entire lives under an authoritarian system, exposure to democratic ideas was often their first encounter with alternative political philosophies. The turning point in the war came in August of 1945 with the surrender of Japan, following the use of atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For prisoners at Camp McCoy, the news arrived like a thunderbolt. Japan, the nation they had been taught was invincible, had surrendered unconditionally. The emperor himself had announced the surrender via radio broadcast, an unprecedented event in Japanese history. The immediate aftermath of the surrender saw a range of reactions among the prisoners. Some wept openly, grieving for their defeated nation and the families they feared might have perished. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process the magnitude of what had occurred. A few expressed relief that the killing would finally end. The camp administration increased monitoring during this period, concerned about potential suicide attempts. But while some prisoners contemplated taking their own lives in response to the national disgrace, most were dissuaded by fellow prisoners or by the recognition that their families back home would need them in the difficult times ahead. In the months following the surrender, the repatriation process began. Though it would take considerable time to transport thousands of prisoners from camps across America back to Japan. During this waiting period, the atmosphere at Camp McCoy shifted. With the war over, many prisoners felt freer to speak more openly about their experiences and to engage more fully with their American captors. Educational programs saw increased participation as prisoners sought practical skills for rebuilding their lives. The International Red Cross conducted interviews with prisoners preparing for repatriation, documenting their treatment and gathering data on compliance with Geneva Convention standards. These interviews revealed the profound impact that the camp experience had made on many prisoners. While most remained patriotic Japanese citizens who had served their nation honorably, many also expressed respect for American institutions and appreciation for the treatment they had received, sentiments that would have been unthinkable at the war's beginning. Sergeant Henderson, the medical corpsman, wrote a final letter to his wife as prisoner repatriation was concluding. "Today we said goodbye to the last group heading home. Yamamoto, the pilot who came to us so broken and terrified, shook my hand and gave me a small carved wooden bird he'd made in craft class. He said through the interpreter that he wanted me to know that not all Japanese were the monsters Americans had been told about, and that not all Americans were the monsters he'd been told about. He said that maybe if enough people on both sides understood that, there wouldn't need to be another war. I think that might be the most important thing that happened here, more important than guarding prisoners or following Geneva Convention rules. We helped a few thousand men see past propaganda and fear to recognize shared humanity. The return to Japan was profoundly difficult for former POWs. They arrived in a nation devastated by war, occupied by American forces, and facing an uncertain future. The social stigma of having been captured remained strong in the immediate post-war period, and many former prisoners faced discrimination in employment and social relationships. Some families initially refused to acknowledge their returned relatives, viewing their survival as evidence of dishonor. Yet these former prisoners also carried with them experiences and perspectives that would contribute to post-war Japan's transformation. Having directly observed democratic institutions functioning, having experienced treatment that respected human dignity even between enemies, many former POWs became advocates for democratic reforms and international cooperation in the rebuilding of Japan. While their influence was subtle rather than dramatic, they formed part of the broader process through which Japanese society evolved in the occupation period and beyond. Lieutenant Yamamoto returned to his family home in Osaka to find his neighborhood largely destroyed by bombing. His father, a traditional man who had supported the war effort, initially would not speak to him because of the shame of his capture. But as months passed and the reality of American occupation became clear, conversations began. Yamamoto shared his experiences at Camp McCoy, describing the medical care, the food, the educational programs, the respect shown despite the war. His father listened, and slowly his perspective shifted. Years later, Yamamoto would say that his father's acceptance of his experience was the moment he knew Japan could rebuild not just its infrastructure, but its relationship with its former enemies. The story of Japanese prisoners of war in America, particularly at camps like McCoy in Wisconsin, represents a fascinating historical footnote that illuminated larger truths about war, culture, and humanity. The American decision to treat these prisoners according to international law and humanitarian principles, despite strong public sentiment against Japan and concerns about reciprocal treatment of American POWs, reflected a commitment to values that transcended the immediate passions of wartime. For the prisoners themselves, the experience challenged fundamental assumptions about their enemies and forced a painful but ultimately constructive re-evaluation of beliefs that had been presented as absolute truths. The cognitive dissonance created by expecting torture and receiving medical care, expecting starvation and receiving adequate food, expecting contempt and receiving respect, opened mental space for questioning other aspects of wartime indoctrination. The guards, medical personnel, and civilians who interacted with these prisoners also underwent transformations, learning to see past racial and national categories to recognize individual human beings with families, hopes, fears, and dignity. This mutual recognition across the boundaries of war and culture demonstrated that even in the midst of total conflict, humane treatment was possible, and that such treatment could plant seeds for eventual reconciliation. The broader implications of this story extend to questions about how societies treat those they define as enemies, how propaganda and indoctrination shape perceptions, and how direct human contact can challenge and sometimes break down those constructions. The Japanese prisoners who expected torture and found care instead experienced a form of psychological transformation that no amount of propaganda could have achieved. Their direct observation of American society, institutions, and values did more to counter Japanese wartime ideology than any number of dropped leaflets or radio broadcasts. This historical episode also highlights the complex relationship between military necessity and humanitarian principles. The American treatment of Japanese POWs served practical purposes. It simplified camp management, potentially encouraged others to surrender, and set an example that might influence treatment of American prisoners. But it also reflected a principled commitment to maintaining certain standards of behavior even toward enemies who had committed atrocities against Allied personnel elsewhere. This tension between pragmatism and principle is a recurring theme in the history of warfare, and remains relevant to contemporary debates about treatment of detainees and prisoners. The camp at McCoy in Wisconsin, like other POW camps across America, functioned as an unlikely space of cultural exchange and transformation. Japanese prisoners observed American civilian life, work ethic, family structures, and democratic institutions firsthand. They saw a nation at war maintaining productive agriculture, educating children, and conducting normal civic activities despite the massive military mobilization. These observations contrasted sharply with the image of a decadent, weak America that Japanese propaganda had promoted. The educational programs offered at the camps, while limited in scope and duration, introduced democratic concepts and practical skills that some former prisoners would later apply in post-war Japan. The exposure to alternative political philosophies, even in a controlled setting, created intellectual openings that would be expanded by the American occupation authorities after the war. Some former POWs became teachers, community leaders, or advocates for international cooperation, bringing their unique perspective to the rebuilding of Japanese society. The medical care provided to prisoners deserves particular emphasis, as it represented perhaps the most visceral contradiction to prisoner expectations. Men who arrived with infected wounds, tropical diseases, and malnutrition, expecting to be left to suffer or die, instead received treatment that matched or exceeded what they would have received in Japanese military hospitals. American doctors and nurses worked to save lives without regard to nationality or the war's hatreds, embodying a professional ethic that transcended the conflict. This experience of professional medical care, administered without cruelty or condescension, made a lasting impression on many prisoners and contributed to post-war Japanese respect for American medical practices and institutions. The psychological journey of prisoners from expectation of torture to acceptance of humane treatment followed patterns that would later interest historians and psychologists studying belief change and cognitive adaptation. The initial phase of terror and suspicion gave way gradually to confusion, as predicted mistreatment failed to materialize. This confusion then evolved into reluctant acceptance of the reality before them, followed eventually by active engagement with camp life and opportunities. The final phase, often occurring after the war's end, involved integration of the camp experience into personal narratives and broader understanding of the war and its meanings. Not all prisoners underwent this transformation successfully or completely. Some remained bitter about their capture and never fully accepted the reality of American treatment, viewing it cynically as manipulation or propaganda. Others struggled with guilt about surviving comfortably, while their families and fellow soldiers suffered. Some prisoners experienced lasting psychological trauma from the cognitive dissonance of having their entire worldview challenged so fundamentally. The camp experience, while generally humane, still represented a profound disruption and forced reassessment that was painful for many prisoners regardless of the material conditions of their captivity. The role of Japanese-American interpreters and cultural advisors in the camps represents another fascinating aspect of this story. These men, often serving while their own families faced internment or discrimination on the West Coast, provided essential bridges between cultures and perspectives. Their presence demonstrated to Japanese prisoners that ethnic identity did not determine national loyalty, that people of Japanese heritage could be fully American, and that America's multi-ethnic society could function despite the strains of war. For the Japanese-American servicemen themselves, working with prisoners from Japan created complex emotional experiences, connecting them to a cultural heritage they valued, while serving a nation they had chosen as their own. As the last prisoners departed Camp McCoy and other facilities in late 1945 and throughout 1946, they carried with them memories and experiences that would influence the next chapter of Japanese-American relations. The occupation of Japan, which began immediately after surrender, brought American forces into direct administration of Japanese society. The relatively positive experiences of former POWs with American military personnel may have contributed in small ways to the general acceptance of occupation authorities by the Japanese population. While the occupation faced resistance and challenges, it did not encounter the widespread hostility that might have been expected after such a bitter war, and former prisoners' accounts of American behavior may have played a role in this acceptance. The camp at McCoy itself returned to military training purposes after the war, and eventually was redesignated as Fort McCoy, continuing to serve as a military installation. The barracks that housed Japanese prisoners were used for other purposes or demolished, and physical traces of the POW camp gradually disappeared. But the human legacy of those years, the thousands of individual encounters between former enemies, the small acts of dignity and respect that accumulated into a different understanding, that legacy persisted in the lives of those who experienced it. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.